Thank you all for coming. I honestly wasn't, like, really thank you. I wasn't sure if, we weren't sure if there would be 5 people or 2 people. So thank you for coming out. And we've set up this arrangement, instead of doing our typical presentation style, more of a, maybe a fireside chat of sorts. So please feel free to interrupt us if you have questions in the middle, but there'll also be questions, time for questions at the end. So it has been a real pleasure. This is our first collaboration since Brittany's been on board. And it's a real thrill to get to present to you a project that isn't on display upstairs right now, because typically it feels like we're doing these presentations when things are already on the wall or things are already installed. So what you're seeing today are ideas in progress. I think they're pretty fleshed out at this point, but still some ideas in progress. And Taking Space is an exhibition that opens on July 16th at PAFA. It'll be open through December, and it'll be right upstairs in the Fisher Brooks Gallery, so the really big space upstairs. We're taking a lot of space for the show. But it's part of a year-long celebration of women at PAFA, but I think all of you likely know that at PAFA we do a lot more than 1 year to celebrate women at PAFA. We've been having a lot of wonderful attention for our collecting practices and our success in really advancing beyond a lot of other museums in the country in collecting women artists and also artists of color. So this exhibition is a reflection of that. The majority of the work in this exhibition either has never been on display at the museum or is a recent acquisition, which is something that we're all quite proud of. So part of what we've been thinking about with the show is frankly the way women artists take up space with their work. So certainly we're talking about size and scale, because that's certainly one way, but also looking at the strategies that make this into political gestures. Although the term political we use in a loose way. The way they use strategies like repetition and rhythm, thinking about the body and space as well as the built environment, how all those sort of strategies add up to, in some ways, political gestures or in order to put a message forward. So if you think about mid-century or early 20th century abstract expressionism, for example, the show doesn't go back that far. We're really into the 70s and beyond here. But one of the ideas that we talked a lot about was the way that women artists that were abstract expressionists really worked to paint large like the men, to show that they deserve to take up just as much space as them and to sort of fight that work on the wall. And also the way that they translated those gestures in abstraction into what they were doing in the 1970s, for example, with more figurative work, which you do see reflected in this exhibition. So we're going to take you through just some of the work today. There's a lot of incredible work that we're not able to show you, so you'll just have to come back on July 16th and check it out. And I'm gonna let Brittany kick it off with sort of the theoretical structure of the show and the themes.
Yeah, so that's a great intro. I thought I would do a bit of the sort of showing the behind the scenes thinking on this. I see some of our students are here, so I'm hoping this will be especially useful for you all. So I want to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about politicizing space and our approach to thinking about space. And so we're sort of taking for granted that space has always been political and it's always been gendered. Our expectations about who belongs in public or private space, in commercial or domestic space, who's supposed to occupy more physical space in the world or less space in the world has always been tied to how people occupy gender or ethnicity or class. And so if I can be a little bit nerdy. So in her writing about gender and space, the anthropologist Amy Meredith Cox sort of observes, space can be tangible, a material geography created through processes of mapping and demarcation. Space can be impalpable, sustained by ideas, beliefs, and practices that define identities and establish invisible yet powerful boundaries. Space is everywhere. It surrounds us like air, and just as organically inhaling and exhaling establishes the dynamic, expansive and constricting context for life and death. Human beings attempt to locate and structure space as space locates and structures human beings. And so this grounds, I think, some of our thinking about how this is particularly true for artists, because the importance of space for artists isn't just a matter of sort of technical mastery over positive and negative space in creating work, or how we're thinking about pattern and repetition in this exhibition and in this work, but it's also about the material geography, you know, if I'm drawing on Cox here, and beliefs and practices about the world. So I'm thinking about things like who has the right to be an artist in the world, to claim themselves as an artist, to go to art school, to establish a studio, where it's possible to establish a studio. If we think about things like political economy, who can afford to have a studio? In what parts of the world do you need to live? If you are a parent, like what kind of space do you need to carve out in your social life to establish a practice and to be a working artist? And so because PAFA has been a collecting institution for hundreds of years, we're also thinking about the museum as a particular kind of space where artwork gets shown that's different from like an art fair or a gallery. And this has been politicized by a lot of artists and arts professionals, whether they are protesting the history of museum collecting and exhibition practices or working to reroute it. And so thinking about Helen Molesworth, who writes, in How to Install Art as a Feminist, she asks, how do we redress the incomplete history currently on view in most museums? Given that art made by women and subsequently by feminist artists, women and feminists not being the same thing, has been so prominently absent, what forms of history can feminism offer in the space of the museum? And more specifically, if art objects demand of their viewers various forms of competence for interpretation, what conditions of exhibition does the museum need to establish to create and satisfy those demands? For instance, if feminist works demand that viewers draw on new and different skills to interpret them, how can the museum help create and accommodate those skills? And so I think it's also interesting to think about what it means to interpret collections. And so this is why not all of the work is overtly political. We're choosing to be political about how we interpret some of the work, and sort of taking seriously like what it means to put these works in conversation about politics in ways that sometimes the artists don't intend, but we still think the work invites that kind of interpretation and conversation in a way that we think is really productive. And I think we're also thinking about the different waves of feminism that mean that, you know, third wave feminists can take for granted certain gains made by second wave feminists, and that's the point of some of these movements, right? But it still is interesting to think about how we can politicize them in conversation, even if the individual makers don't. And so thinking about this absence and putting them in conversation, what would it mean to take seriously the very historical condition under which the work of women artists is both produced and understood? So this is why we also like to begin with this image of Deborah Willis, which is called I Made Space for a Good Man. And I'm blocking the triptych a little bit for those of you in the room. And so this is a print made at the Brandywine Workshop and Archives that also happens to be on view upstairs right now in Fisher Brooks Gallery in Making Community. I'm gonna be a little indulgent and read. So the lithograph shows 3 images of the pregnant artist reclining in a wicker chair as hands from a figure out of frame reach out to touch Willis's belly. The first 2 photos are framed by the words, for those of you who can't read, from the distance, a woman taking space from a good man. And the second image, in quotations, you took the space from a good man. And the third image is framed by the words, I made a space for a good man. The phrase, you took the space from a good man, was said to Willis by a male art professor in the early 1970s who lamented her presence in an art program here in Philadelphia, predicting that she would get married, have a baby, and take up space that could have gone to a good male student. The professor implied that Willis's gender and presumed plans for marriage and motherhood would be incompatible with an arts practice and career of substance. His expectations for her future that had not yet arrived influenced his opinion that her seat in the classroom and presence in the program was undeserved, this improper allocation of institutional space. So following Molesworth, we're thinking about the conditions of the conditions under which women artists are made. And it allows us to read this image as a kind of allegory, as a history that the personal is political. It elevates as an experience that Willis has, that a lot of women artists have had, in producing arts in institutions that challenge their very presence and their right to be in them. And we can also see this image as a triumph. Willis went on to have a successful career as an artist, as an art historian, and in this image, she's pregnant with Hank Willis Thomas, who also went on to be an artist who's represented in PAFA's collection. And so this is a nice way to tie together a lot of the things that we're thinking about, both who gets to be in art space, whether that's art school or art museums, what kind of production is valued in our society, whether that's the physical reproduction of the body or artistic production or intellectual production, the kind of curatorial work and collecting work and the research and writing that is really unsexy behind the scenes, but is necessary to do this kind of work to collect and exhibit artwork by female artists. And so it's also, it's a kind of anchor in thinking about PAFA's own history in Philadelphia and in the art world. And in this image where we get to see, an artist in our collection pregnant with another artist in our collection, which is like a fun little Easter egg for us. So one of the things we're thinking about in this exhibition is space as seriality. And so if you think about the Willis triptych, the technique of relying on repeating an image or forms of an image over and over and over again in a piece where you have a number of small parts that make up a whole. And so this is Deborah Priestley. Can everybody see the writing? Okay. So this is Somewhere Listening, Company B, the 365th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division. And in this image, Deborah Priestley is an artist who draws on her own family archive. One of the sort of foundation images of this massive installation is a soldier and her family. And so she's thinking about the history of how Black men in particular get represented and how we think about American military history. But she's also thinking about what it is to be part of an army, to be part of the military, that you have a number of tiny parts that make up a whole. And so there's a way that when we think about war and war making and nation building, there's this sort of general idea of a faceless mass that establishes these things. And Priestley is really trying to make the individual faces sort of highlight their individuality here. And so it's playing on the idea of repetition to make relevant that, this is so many people who have been erased from American history, who've contributed to it, but what does it mean to take seriously this massive installation, right? To take this as a whole piece, where you have to understand individually by each piece that each of these is a human being.
And this specific photograph is in honor of her great uncle, who was one of the men in this platoon platoon. I'm not sure if that's the right military term, but in this group of men. I mean, the other part, if you saw this piece installed, this is one that has been installed at PAFA in the World War I exhibition, for example, a couple years ago. The other part that I really like about this, as we're thinking about taking space, is she's taking this photograph that has a small scale. Perhaps it's in an archive, it's in a family archive, and really. Not only taking the time and space to draw each of these individual men very carefully, but also spreading it out on the wall and giving them that space in a museum, which also sort of insists on importance. The next work, we're like going back and forth. We're riffing here. Is a hot off the press is the right term to use here. This is a new print by Polly Applebaum that, as you can see in this photo, it's actually not finished. Those are butterfly clips at the top, so I apologize, but this is the best we have right now. But it's a very large, it's probably 7 feet tall, woodcut print that she's working on at Durham Press. And so it's based on her own family heritage in some ways in Philadelphia, and her interest in the fracturer sort of arts and crafts and things that have been going around. So the way she's building patterns, we're lucky to have another quite large piece by Polly Applebaum that some of you may have seen at Temple University, a piece she did based on the Gene Davis street mural that was in the 70s in front of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I wish I could say that we could get that one out. That one's a little bit more complicated, but we're working on it. But Polly will be represented in this exhibition by this print. And when you think about the artists that have really taken space and worked to take space throughout their career for many, many years. Polly is one of those artists, whether that's on the wall or in her more floor-based sculptures and the way she's thinking about color and pattern and brightness. And certainly a link to the feminist pattern and decoration movement, which we'll talk about a little later on in the presentation. The next piece is something that I was surprised to learn that had never been on view, sadly, at PAFA. This is a Jennifer Bartlett work called Subdivision that we are quite excited to get out for you all to see. Again, you know, as we were talking about Polly Applebaum and those women that are really using scale in interesting ways, and Jennifer Bartlett is known for making these monumentally sized work. And also when you think about people using rhythm and repetition and building images from small things into larger wholes, Jennifer Bartlett is also that person. We have some lovely grid-based works that she's done, but the house and house and home were one of the images that she returns to again and again. One of those symbols that she comes back to. So one of the and I think you see this even in a digital image. It's remarkably painted when you see it up close. The way she paints is just incredibly beautiful, but it's also breaking it down into those squares and rectangles and triangles. When you look at that repetition of abstract geometric parts that add up into this larger whole of this thing that is a repetition, a subdivision. It's a repetition of homes, oftentimes the same looking homes in this very long horizontal work.
Yeah, and it's also...
well...
It is... I knew someone would ask. It's 36 by 108 inches. So it's a sizable piece. It's considerably long, and I think we've been talking about how to get at feminist architecture and the built environment in this exhibition, and the sort of domestic space. So every time I see this image, I hear that song in my head, that Little Boxes on the Hillside, and like this idea of the repeating home in space, these subdivisions where you get, one or two or three floor plans repeated over and over and over again across like a district or a neighborhood. This piece feels like representation of that, and it continues a trend of women artists dealing with domesticity in the home in a way that I think is really creative and interesting. Njideka Akunyili Crosby's I Always Face You Even When It Seems Otherwise is a beloved piece here at PAFA. It's 2 panels. It's a work on paper. And Crosby is a PAFA alum. And so in this image, what's really interesting is that, you have the larger images made up of this moment of embrace between Njideka and her now husband, sort of embracing in a room full of who we imagine are Njideka's family members. But when you get to see this piece up close, it's made up of a number of tiny images that are repeated over and over and over again. This bits of that are pieces from Nigerian magazines and reproductions of family photos. It's this kind of photo transfer process that's really beautiful when you stand back a ways from it. It takes up quite a bit of space. This is one of the larger pieces in PAFA's collection, but when you get up really close to it, you can see that all of these light-colored images that make up her clothes, the figure's shirts, and I believe the lettering in this image are also tiny bits of, again, the idea of like the family archive. How do you capture the family archive in your art? How do you insert your own self in the art historical in a form in this way? This is a piece that's doing that kind of work.
Well, and one of the things that you'll notice is that, a lot of the work in the show could certainly cross the different thematic areas. I think that many are sort of interchangeable in the way that they're intersecting with these themes for sure, and Njideka is one of those. And that's certainly thinking about the way artists use their body in different ways to talk about scale and political gestures. And one of the ways, Joan Brown is an artist who is based in the Bay Area, known for her figurative work, certainly, which PAFA has a very long history of. And in fact, we have a long history of women working quite largely, if you think about artists like Cecilia Beau, for example. So even in the 19th century, they were encouraging to sort of paint as big as the men. But Joan Brown had a complicated relationship to feminism, as artists, as many artists did and still do, women artists did and still do. One of the things is she seemed to, for me, sort of walk the walk of feminism, maybe rather than talking about it in a lot of ways. And so this was a recent acquisition that I have to say I'm very, very proud of. It's a painting that I'd always hoped to bring into a public collection. But it's a self-portrait of Joan Brown in 1977. And I'm wondering if there are any clues to you. Do you all think that this is how Joan Brown looked when she painted? So it's this lovely parody that if you look a little closer, you realize, boy, was Joan Brown really sitting in a 1950s house dress with white gloves? She did paint in gloves because the paint caused allergies, and her high heels, and then obviously painting a very dainty still life. That was not how she painted. And if you look at the very bottom of the floor there, you get a clue. That's the mess of the paint that you would normally see, that's more normal to her studio practice. But it is, in a way, a look inside a studio of a woman's artist, sort of that intimate, private space. And in the back of the painting is another work that she did about an affair that she had, a whole series that she did. And there's two lovers embracing in the back of that painting. So also in this painting, which is a large-scale figurative painting about the way that Joan Brown painted largely, throwing paint all over her studio, there's another quite large painting in the back, as if to hammer that painting home about how she saw her place in this artistic world. And this painting's from the 1970s. And a more recent acquisition, a piece by Makeda Ahuja, which is called A Real Allegory of an Artist in Her Studio. And so this is another self-portrait. This is an image of Makeda. She's certainly talking about putting the place of a woman artist in the painting, but also thinking of her position as a woman artist of color. So one of the things that I love about this painting, and why I think it's absolutely perfect of PAFA, is that in some ways it talks about the history of painting, both Western, Eastern, India. It's all mixed into this work, and not to mention also how one paints and how one learns to paint. So if you look at the bottom left, I hope I'm not in the way. There's a textbook and a sketchbook of her working out sort of those perspective drawings on how to build the painting. And then what's hard to tell in a digital image, perhaps, is that the curling of the corners, that's all trompe l'oeil. So her technique of painting is also really sort of, I don't know, for painting geeks, I guess, is what I think when I think of it. It's a painter's painting. But the histories that she's talking about as well, this is an Indian prayer card that's that she's holding in her hand, for example. So thinking about how those vernacular images have informed her own practice and the way she forms her identity in her painting. You want to take it, or do you want? You go. Okay. This is a work by a PAFA alum, actually, named D Haines. This is, actually, I don't know if you have the exact dimensions, but it's 4 feet by 4 feet, roughly, painting of a woman named Janie, and this is a painting. It may look like a photograph when we have it on digital images, but I want to reassert that. Clarity's certainly interested in those bodies that we do not see featured in paintings. PAFA, we talk about this painting a lot, but PAFA owns one of the first nude paintings ever shown in the United States, the Vanderlyn painting of Ariadne. So go next door after this and look at it. But you'll notice that she's an incredibly beautiful, classic nude, posed very, very sexily. Well, those were the images that we're all used to seeing. I think were and still are used to seeing in images of women, especially when they're nude. And so Clarity has been working to think about those bodies that haven't been featured in figurative painting, all the way back from working. She would go to Lilith Fair, for example, and sketch women. And make paintings out of them. She's been doing a series of portraitures where she's been inviting women into her studio and making these incredible, very detailed paintings that are scaled up to fill the canvases. And what I love about these paintings is, of course, the flesh. We talk a lot about flesh in painting, and whether those be really thickly painted, sort of juicy paintings of sort, or something that's more sort of the way representational and the way clarity can paint that flesh. And along similar lines.
So Mickalene Thomas's Din is sort of a beloved piece at PAFA. It's on view often. This is the large scale piece on the left. And I think this is the one slide where I have the dimensions because we're thinking about the juxtaposition of these two pieces. So the large piece, that's 120 by 96 on view, is a painting, but it's also, the surface is finished with a number of rhinestones, and so it's a collage piece of sorts. And Mickalene Thomas has always been interested in, bodies that we see represented in art history and figures that we aren't used to seeing, and sort of like populating her work with the kinds of people that we aren't used to seeing. But a recent acquisition on the right, the photo collage, which is 6 inches by 8 inches, we think is interesting for another reason. First, you can see a kind of like the source material that Thomas is working from to get that larger image. I think there are some surprises there. And then we're also thinking about, if you use scale as a verb, we get to think about how an artist of this kind of stature that she's received at this point, how an artist scales. So thinking about how an artist goes from this tiny 6 inch by 8 inch piece to this piece that's 96 by 120, what translates as larger and what doesn't. It's also just really lovely to see like a photo of her sitter. And so that you get to see both not just Mickalene's representation of the sitter, but also the sitter herself. And this is a new acquisition, Elizabeth Columba, called Writing Places. And if you can't tell from this image, I know digitally it looks like an illustration, but it's actually a watercolor, which is really phenomenal. I think it's such an excellent watercolor. And Elizabeth Columba is also thinking about how bodies get represented in fine art. This is part of a series that she did that got, I think, a lot of art world attention because it sort of came to public view at the same time that Posing Modernity was up in New York, and we were thinking about the Black body represented in Western art, and Columba was one of these contemporary figures who was populating her pieces with the kinds of women that you do not typically see represented in Western art, and so she's attending to the kinds of detail like the adornment of a figure, where she positions a figure in her work, the other things that are around them, because she's really invested in a kind of sort of old world European art historical training where you typically do not see Black bodies at a kind of sort of at leisure. So if you think about Manet's Olympia and why there's been a lot of conversation around the serving figure in the background that frequently was skipped over in museum showings of that painting or in art historical lectures of that painting, Columba sort of extending that conversation and thinking, well, what might it mean to think about those bodies not in sort of subservient positions in that work, but to see them as the central figures of that work?
This is a PAFA favorite that we're very excited to get back out again. Alice Neels' Claudia Bach, Pregnant. This, of course, connects right back to the Deb Willis piece. The Deb Willis piece is the piece where all these things, all roads seem to come back to Deb Willis. But just the fact that I mean, how many times do we seeing a nude woman pregnant is still somehow surprising, even shocking. I have to say, anecdotally, we get a lot of feedback on this painting from visitors. Some people are frankly surprised to see it. So why is it okay to see Ariadne in her classic sexy pose, but this image, which is, I mean, the stare is incredible. Claudia is staring right at you in this image. But why do people shy away from the pregnant body in that way? And it also relates to a group of work that we recently acquired by Judy Gellis. I think we're going to show 2 photos from this series. I know you love these. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, I really do. I think that there's it's always nice to see artists deploy humor in their work. And so if we're thinking about production and reproduction and the kinds of work that women do and the work that women artists do, what work counts as art. It's nice, I think, to have in conversation both these artists that are depicting women's bodies pregnant, sometimes in self-portraiture, and these fantastic Jodi Throckmorton photos where on the left, the image from May 23rd, 1978, she has written, "I would love to be able to go to the bathroom alone." And I think that that is an impulse that a number of women can identify with, particularly women artists who have small children. It's also just a great photo, just in every kind of like photo nerd sort of way, both the vantage point, the composition, like that smile, those smiles on her children's faces. Like, it's lovely that they are just really enjoying with great glee this imposition on her private space. And then on the right, this is a photo from a year later in March 1979, which reads, her caption, "On Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoon, Jason is at nursery school and David naps, and I have 1.5 hours of free time to be creative and do important things." And there's everything about that is hilarious. So one, I think that, you know, this is an image of her eating and watching daytime soaps, which if you think about, you know, the artist at leisure, I think most working artists know that you do need leisure time to make good work. All of your productivity is not just about working nonstop all the time. You actually do need to rest. But there's also like the humor in that caption of 1.5 hours to do creative work, to be creative. She really is pushing viewers to think about what it means to be a woman artist, how that isn't actually inseparable for the rest of her life. All of her other identities, she's an artist, she's a mother, she's a partner. How do all of those things come together and impede on her ability to take her own space to make work? And there's a way that making that domestic life part of the work, making that the substance of the work itself, is a very political gesture.
And it's a representation of a studio, too, which is interesting. I feel like we could go back to the Joan Brown or the Makeda Ahuja and say, well, this is her studio. And one of the things that Judy's talked about this work is that her being home with her children actually provoked her to take a photography class, I believe, which led to this first body of work. So this is one of the first series of photos that she ever did, which I think is interesting because we've all talked to artists who have talked about being a parent and how sort of having to work at the kitchen table or wherever has also brought about breakthroughs in your work. You make that time or you make that space for creativity.
And so we have like a great suite of Guerrilla Girls prints, but of course we're thinking about, you know, if we're dealing with the nude, if we're dealing with gender and the nudes in this exhibition, we do want to be thinking about how we think and talk about these nude women's bodies, even when it's self-portraiture. And so what's nice is that the Guerrilla Girls, who have been pushing at the art world for decades, this piece that's updated from this is dated 2012. They did an earlier version of this from the 80s, but they are pointing out that, you know, in a museum, in most East Coast museums, and the statistic is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they're pointing out less than 4% of the artists are women, but 76% of the nudes are female. And this is a slightly better, I think, statistic than it was in the 80s, but this is still fairly recent. This is a few years ago.
Well, and along those lines, we had to include some male nudes, of course, as there have been quite a few female artists that have ventured into that territory. Sylvia Slay being one of the most pioneering. This is a 1970 image of Robert Lucy. She was, I think, very respectfully thinking about putting men in these similar fantasy situations that women have long been put into. But in some ways, I think in a less objectifying way, because as much as this is certainly a nude image of Robert Lucy, and you have the fantastical background behind it, you're in perhaps a fantasy. His body is still presented in a very matter-of-fact way. If you look at how he's painted, for example, she hasn't taken the hair off of him, for example. Hair's pretty political when you think about it, especially in the way nude women have been shown in paintings for many, many, many years. You don't often see hair on those women, for example. So Robert Lucy is in his full glory. The other piece is a recent painting by Mira Shore. Mira is, I guess, like Deb Willis, is known for her scholarship as much as she's known for her painting. This is a 12-part work by her called Ma Mi Ma that is all about the transmission of language, the transmission of ideas, and you see how the language goes in and out of the ear and through the penis. It's kind of this moment of doing large phallus paintings that she made. She made a series in the 1980s called her Dick Paintings, and so this is from that series.
And this is Betty Starr. We've been really indulgent, so I just want to give us a time check.
That's why I rushed a little bit.
Yes, and so this is Betty Starr's Shadow with Rubble, Wall, Laurel Canyon from 1988. This is a textile, so we also wanted to, we were thinking about, the fact that, one, this is a piece that's on fabric that is somewhat opaque that you can see through. One of the things I think that we're being political about in this exhibition is materiality. So there's a kind of sometimes unspoken hierarchy about materials in museums where people know that, paintings, sculptures, drawings, works on paper, photography sometimes, these are works that we understand to be fine art. And a lot of materials that a number of women artists have worked in, both in terms of the visuality and the material itself, there have been sort of various kinds of pushes to see certain materials as fine art. And so when we talk about pattern and decoration, when we talk about textiles, when we talk about adornment, sort of rhinestones, installation, we're thinking about, no, what does it mean to apprehend these materials as also fine art? Fine art is not just painting, drawing, and sculpture. And so it's nice to have one of Betty Starr's textile pieces. It's also nice to think about the figure as a shadow, how you represent the body, not necessarily as a realistic depiction of the figure, but as her own shadow. And so this is a nice piece that does that work. Maria Barrio, which is a recent acquisition, also does this in a similar way. And so this will be nice to get on view every time I see it in person. I cannot believe that this is cut paper, that fringe you're seeing. It's not drawn or painted on. It's this fringe paper.
This is another, just to speak a little bit more about collage, this is a Wangechi Mootoo, a recent acquisition that we've had on display. So thinking about the way Mootoo builds these compositions into collage, and as well as an Ebony G. Patterson piece that we've had now for a couple years, but we haven't been able to get out. It's one of her really large scale two tapestries. It's both tapestries and the fabric wallpaper behind it, which is a pink polka dot. And go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that what's fun about both the Mootoo piece and Patterson is the use of all of these colors that get sort of associated with women and the feminine. I was recently reading an interview, I think, or listening to an interview where someone asked the artist Howardina Pindell about, what it was like to be an art student at Yale in the 1960s. And she was saying one of the things that frustrated her about being one of the only women in her program was that she noticed that when the men used red and white together, it was the image was described as red and white, and when she used red and white together, it was always described by professors as pink. And so what it means to even just name the color pink as a kind of color that women work with, that when men work with, it's not pink. And so I think that it's really interesting to think about this next generation of artists using pink in this way that is meant to draw you in or draw certain viewers in because, oh, it's very pretty, so you're drawn to it. Both Mootoo and Patterson use it in this way to kind of bait and switch you. So the Mootoo piece is actually about a slave ship, which is very easy to miss if you're sort of focused on like the bits of it that are shiny or that it's adorned with pearl. Patterson, similarly, there are toys on this. There are, I think, Mardi Gras beads, there are brooches, there's glitter. And when you get right up close to it, you see that the base tapestry is this really great embroidered images of all of these Black children, and there are bullet holes in them. And so she's sort of pushing viewers to think about what it means to see Black children as children, which is often not the way that Black children are depicted in the United States.
And a lot of this connects right back to the pattern and decoration movement. When you think of people like Miriam Shapiro, for example, and the way that she was rethinking women's work, quote unquote women's work, right? Embroidery, using cloth, into her femage collages and assemblage work. This is a very large kimono work that we have by her, and I think the lineage to people like Ebony, to people like even Wangechi Mootoo is in that same circle. A new acquisition by an artist named Marie Watt, who's based in Oregon. This is I think it's 19 feet wide, piece made of reclaimed whirl blankets. Marie is of the Seneca Nation. She's an indigenous artist. And this is work that she's making called Skywalker, Skyscraper, and it's based on a moment when she moved to Brooklyn briefly and realized that she was living in the same neighborhood as where Iroquois workers lived while they were building the skylines in Manhattan in the 1950s. Because one of the things that happened is that they would come, they hired these people to come to Manhattan, build these skyscrapers, because they didn't often use safety harnesses to make the skyscrapers because of certain work that they did. But when you think about, I mean, there's a lot of other things to obviously connect Marie's work to, but when you think about the history of wool blankets, especially in the indigenous communities, both as a gesture that Marie talks about something that's used to honor people, to gift people, but also if we think about the history of colonialism in the United States and the way that wool blankets were used to spread disease as part of to the native populations. But in some ways, this work is a bit of a memorial to these skywalkers. It's because she talks about how these circles expand and contract, and thinking about their view up on these structures, observing the rising and setting sun as they were working. So we're excited to get this work out and show you all. Viola Frye, I'll run through these a little bit quickly because I do want to get to the last section. But Viola Frye, this is a monumental clay sculpture by Viola. Talk about of all the badass women sculptors in the world, she was certainly one of them. Another California artist based in the Bay Area, often making large pieces of men in business suits that always looked sad and depressed and hunkered over, but also glorifying the grandmothers in their very colorful dresses and asserting that they're a big part of they can be important sculptures too. And of course we're lucky to have quite a few actually Louise Nevelson sculptures at PAFA. And these are two these are about this 1972 work is one of the earliest works in the show. But as we think about the built environment that Brittany was talking about, Nevelson is certainly one of the totemic artists in that regard.
Definitely. She has a lot of public sculpture up that people are used to seeing, and these are pieces that are, in particular, drawing their imagery from a historic church in New York, St. Mark's Church. And so if we're thinking about the built environment and feminist architecture, I think it's sort of nice to see that represented in this medium. And we're going to fly through these a little bit for time.
Our Elizabeth Murray, this is one of the first pieces. I think it is the first work that she ever made with sort of negative space. So when you think about this is a piece based on a breaking beer glass of all things. I look at it and I think what an incredible a parody of sorts of abstract expressionism it is as well. Brittany was talking about using pink and using colorful images. This is another work that actually, believe it or not, in the museum, we have like one place where it can be stored. It's so big, in fact, and there's only one or two places it can be shown in the museum. So it was one of the pieces that started the thinking around the show, frankly. As well as a new acquisition, one of my favorites that I've been dreaming of getting on the wall is a ceramic piece by Brie Rouet. So certainly if we're connecting it to the Elizabeth Murray, you think about negative space. This is as much a figurative work to me as it is abstract, because the way she makes it is she starts with a mound of clay in her body weight, which is 130 pounds. You'll notice if you look at her body of work, the weight does fluctuate in the titles. And she creates a set of devices through which she's going to work. So in this one, she stood in the middle. So it's hard to tell in this image, but you can see her footprints maybe in the middle. And she used her body proportions to determine how much she would scrape away. And she scraped away until she couldn't scrape away anymore. So it's endurance performance, it's sculpture, it's a figurative work to me. It's another innovation in ceramic as well. And so after the performance of sorts, she does fire these. And this is a series called Stripped Away from Center. And then Winifred Lutz is a I hope many of you know her work. She's a wonderful Philadelphia artist that people should know more. This is a hopefully a recent acquisition, a soon to be, I hope, acquisition. Thinking about light and expanding presence and size through light. This is handmade paper. It's one of the things that Winifred's really known for. And it connects with the work that some of you may have seen here 5 years ago or so. 5 years ago. A piece by Allison Schatz that we commissioned, PAFA commissioned by her, at first to respond to the light in the historic landmark building. This was installed in the Morris Gallery, and you can see the skylight behind it. One of the things that Allison does in this sculpture, and she does in a lot of her work, is thinking about using metal, using materials that are often associated with male artists, or especially if you're working in abstract sculpture, thinking about how that's associated with male artists, but somehow turning that material on its head. So in this case, she used thousands of teeny tiny aluminum pieces that she made and hand wove into these panels of, they look like chainmail of sorts. So it's a heavy aluminum sculpture that looks very light and weightless and plays with the light and movement around it. And we hope to actually hang that in the lobby of this building so that it gets light and collects light in a new way. And finally, we're really quite excited about this because thanks to many people, we were able to acquire a piece by Ellen Harvey that maybe some of you saw at PAFA 15 years ago. Originally, it was installed next door in the rotunda of the historic landmark building. It took over the entire space, and the historic landmark building was blacked out. The skylights were dark and everything. So this is a work that Ellen did commission specifically for PAFA. Those are 12-foot high engraved mirror panels with light boxes behind them lit up. So what we're doing is Ellen has very graciously agreed to reconfigure the piece to be shown on its own in this space. So she's creating a structure through which you'll be able to walk in and be surrounded by these engraved mirror images. So the piece is called Mirror, and it's a mirror up to PAFA, the institution, and the historic landmark building. And it shows a very dystopic future of the Victorian Gothic building, which I think Frank Furness would probably have absolutely loved this piece, because there's nothing more over the top and dystopic than this building even. But it's PAFA falling into disrepair. There are leaves taking it over. And then here's a detail of the mirror, so you can see the grand stairway and some of the lovely parts of the building falling apart. But there are also two videos that are shown. One is images of, this is a sort of composite image of Ellen drawing these mirrors, and at the very end there's a massive crescendo where the mirrors shatter in this video work. You can actually see the camera that she's using as well. And then there are two videos of PAFA's first two locations. Believe it or not, that 1876 buildings is PAFA's third location. So this is also Ellen drawing one of these two locations and alluding to the fact that one of PAFA's first locations burned. So if you're in the piece, you'll be surrounded by these videos, these 4 large-scale engraved mirrors with the light boxes behind it, and then there'll be this moment that'll build up to the buildings catching on fire and the mirror shattering. So it's an absolute, to me, it's one of those, maybe not once in a lifetime, but once every 30 years that you'll be able to see this in this way. So we're excited to be bringing it forward and doing these new things with the piece to present it to our crowd.
And that's a wrap. Whew.
You do. Just a few minutes for questions if anyone has. Yes?
It's not really a question, but a comment. I kept thinking Cindy Sherman, the photographer, and how she fits in the way that she would put indoor and outdoor spaces.
Absolutely. Self-portraiture, thinking about putting yourself in different, yeah, absolutely. That would be incredible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe that's a good, one of the interesting things about this is that this show is limited to what's in our collection. So we need to collect one. We absolutely need her work. So if anyone has any suggestions,
Or if anybody has a Cindy Sherman that
That's
you would
exactly
like to
right.
deposit in an institution.
Questions or thoughts? Thank you for coming. And Senya, did you want to? Identifying as women specifically or as feminists?
Women, so there are no trans artists.
They're not.
Show, and so is that a conversation
Yes.
you had? And, was it again sort of a question of circumstance, perhaps?
Yeah. I have to say that we have collected a fair amount of work by trans artists, but honestly, we talked a lot about it, and it didn't fit in the show by any way. And the more we started thinking about our sort of core group of artists, it really is women identifying office. And in fact, it's something that we've kind of really grappled with a lot for this.
I asked because I grappled with
Yeah.
it. So as peer-to-peer, colleague-to-colleague, I'm just
Yeah.
really curious as how that played out, and I appreciate your candidness.
Well, in the way that trans artists are not included in certain feminist circles. That's not my position. I think that everyone should be included. But for this show and with the collection parameters as well, it just didn't make sense. We really did think a lot about it.
Jodi, if I could
Yeah.
add something else, the bigger context for taking space and their project
Yes.
is also the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment of our getting the right to vote. And one of the things that we all will have to grapple with in this year-long celebration of women getting the right to vote 100 years ago is that not all women got the right to vote. Women of color did not have the opportunity to vote in 100 years ago with the passing of the 19th Amendment. And as we celebrate women, we're throughout the year, throughout the city, throughout the state, there's also the issue of a binary celebration when we're also celebrating a non-binary time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's a bigger discussion that all of us can have with this pointed 100th celebration that's happening around the country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes.
It might be helpful on a lot of those slides if somebody would put the dimensions.
That makes complete sense.
Since we're talking about scale.
Yeah, since we're talking, but I agree with you. I totally agree with you. But also part of the point is that we wanted to, not maybe with that choice, not to include the dimensions, but also part of what we've been trying to hammer home with this project as we talk to our colleagues about it internally and externally, is that it's not all about big things. And that's been hard to get across. Does that make sense? But you're totally right. You're totally right. Yeah. Yes.
Since the 19th century, women have been representing the domestic, and it was an acceptable space for them to occupy. And that seems to be sort of a continuation. But did you find it difficult to find other spaces that women are sort of injecting themselves in? The spaces from which women are generally excluded, kept out of, that where women are sort of injecting themselves into these spaces that generally are not receptive to the feminine.
Yeah, I think the Columba is an example of that. The watercolor, that work is definitely, that's what she's thinking about, both in terms of art history and those spaces. I'm trying to think of other works in the exhibition that might address that.
Which one was that?
Yes, I'll flip back while you talk.
Sure. I think that so one, we're thinking about what it means to do a kind of insertion into the sort of art historical proper or the historical proper. So the way that a lot of artists have played with history, whether that's Elizabeth Columba sort of inserting figures into historic settings where you typically do not see them. There's a kind of commentary around that that's like, oh, what are these artists doing when they are playing with imagery in a way that's anachronistic? That's intentional. Mickalene Thomas does this in a similar way. This is sort of, it's a reclamation project. I think the Deborah Priestley also does that kind of work. This is a history that happened but has not been represented. That feels like a really important intellectual intervention, both the acknowledgement that here is a history that we have been left out of. I am intentionally claiming on a very real history that happened, but everyone skipped over, both that impulse and the impulse to say, here is a history that we were blocked from, and I want to do a reimagining of these figures by putting them back where they wouldn't have been before. That feels like a kind of, an infiltrating of intellectual space. We're in a school, and so we think about often what that does for curriculum to kind of insert women back into art history or into, military history, or to do that kind of work around like race and gender. I also think that there's a way that the works that are dealing with the built environment do that in a way. We've been thinking a lot about feminist architecture, feminist design, a lot of contemporary conversations that are had around who gets to participate in things like city planning or who gets to go to architecture school, that kind of, there's some work that's not on these slides that's a little more about the environment or interaction with nature. I think that there are a lot of people that are doing really interesting work on this. There'll be more of this in the exhibition.
Was that before or after Kennedy Wiley?
Which one?
Columba?
After.
After,
Yes.
So one of the criticisms that women often get is that they're appropriating male art, right? And so what you were just talking about, this whole thing of using established, and so, that's something that is a criticism that's often leveled against women artists, and they're copying or appropriating or whatever. And is that something that you guys are, I don't feel that way, but is that sort of the discussion that's part of this?
I see that as a citation politics. In the way that it's not uncommon to see writers or musicians draw on or riff on other artists' work. I think that visual artists do that as well. And I think there's a way to sort of read some of this work as very intentional. Like when you see the innovations that these artists make, I feel like we can read that as, that's not a copying just for the sake of copying. It's not a haphazard kind of, I see this and I'm going to replicate it. It's an intentional citing of, I understand what this work is doing, and my intervention is to bend it to my will.
Yes.
So will any of the artists be coming?
We hope so. To speak, likely, yes. Yeah. We're working on that. I'm sorry, I don't have any. I don't think Abby. There's no one confirmed yet.
But we'll do a full announcement.
Yeah.
Promoting our program soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.